I'm Maya from Tailscale, and today I'll be talking about how remote development and remote work can work together. When your team works remotely, there are a few ways that developing remotely can help address and improve your entire team's experience. Tools on their own can't fix organizational challenges, but paired with the right operations, your team can get the best of both worlds with better developer onboarding, developer velocity, and simpler, more secure access to shared resources. I'm Maya Kaczorowski. I'm a product manager at Tailscale. Prior to Tailscale, I was at GitHub and at Google Cloud. Like most people, since March of 2020, I've been working remote. First at GitHub, which is a remote-friendly company, and now at Tailscale, which is a fully remote company. I've also been developing remotely for a while, and that's not really saying much since I don't code a lot. Internally at Google, I got rid of my workstation in about 2018. I was using code spaces at GitHub. And now I do some local development or play around with Gitpod and that type of thing to be able to share things with colleagues. I really think remote dev is the future. So what are we going to be talking about today? First, we'll cover what remote development is and why it's different and a separate business decision than remote work. Then we'll talk about why folks do often conflate these decisions and how they can complement each other. There's a few ways that rolling out remote dev environments for your team can also help improve the remote work experience. Specifically, we'll discuss how remote dev environments help developers onboard and help developers get their work done faster and more efficiently. And setting up access to a shared tool or to a shared environment will ensure that everybody developing remotely can access it, but it'll also force you to improve how you enable access to remote services for all users working remotely as well. So let's dive in. What is remote work? I don't need to explain it much as well. We've all been experiencing it. Remote work is about employees not working in a central place of work, like an office building. But there's a spectrum of setups that qualify as remote work. You might be a single person who's working remotely, say to take care of your sick child who's home from school that day. That could be a one-off, but that is remote work. You might be a distributed team with offices in multiple locations, and you might have employees who are remote part or full-time. You might not even have an office and everyone joins in from their home office or wherever they can get good enough Wi-Fi to join a Zoom meeting, whether that's in a camper van, it could be halfway across the world. That's also remote work. There isn't one way to do remote work, and many companies are still trying to figure out what works for them. So, for example, I'm at Tailscale. We're a fully remote company, as I mentioned. I work from my house, but I'm not always at my house. I'm giving this talk actually from a hotel room in Paris. I join meetings on my laptop, connect with folks in Slack, and when I'm in the Bay Area, about once a month or so, I get to meet up with others who are there and hack together on something in real life, which is a lot of fun. Take another example though, GitLab, which is also a fully remote company. They have a different model for how meetings and decisions are made. Almost all of their product decisions in engineering development is done in text, so that it can be agnostic of time zones, right? It's asynchronous and allows people to work when it's best for them, and therefore also have fewer meetings. So even with fully remote companies, there's choices for how to run your day-to-day work. Amongst other things, you're explicitly deciding, if you have an office, who is working remote, when you work, and how you choose to communicate. Some of the challenges with remote work are onboarding new users. A new employee has a lot of questions, and remote onboarding, even when it's great, can be really tough to follow. Mentoring and giving folks the space that they need to just ask questions and ask for help when they need it. Slack is great for that, but it's still not as great as in person. Providing feedback. Ideally, you want to do some of this in the moment, but that might not work in a bigger Zoom call where you can't just, pull someone aside to have a quick conversation. Working or hacking together on a project, say in front of a whiteboard. And lastly, feeling connected to your colleagues and not as lonely, being remote compared to everybody else. And I'm sure there's other, challenges that I haven't mentioned here. Anyways, like I said, we're all unfortunately familiar with remote work. So let's talk a bit more about remote development. What's remote development? Remote development is using another device rather than the one that you're on to do engineering work. This typically involves spinning up a sandbox environment that has a code editor and a shell and lets you test your code. This environment can be running in the cloud, on another machine you own, or even in a private cloud or on-prem. Many of these solutions are browser-based or at least offer browser options so that the machine that you're on only needs a keyboard and a browser for you to be able to get your work done. You can connect two of your devices together yourself, but there are now many solutions that offer a native development environment for you, including Gitpod, GitHub Codespaces, and Coder. Remote development, strangely enough, doesn't need to be related to whether or not your company has remote work. Remote development is about reproducible environments, accessing shared resources, and the security of your production environment. It can be related to remote work. If you're on the train in the Alps in Italy and trying to get a few code changes in before hitting the slopes, you might only have your iPad and not your production desktop environment. So how do you get your work done? Now, if you're using a remote development environment, what should you expect? You can still tune a remote dev environment in several ways to get the functionality that you need. Your development environment will be built from a container image typically with a common OS. This might be something that's managed by your organization, or it could be a dev container that you maintain yourself. You might also want to include specific dot files, which are user-specific application configurations. So, for example, that could include symlinks for files that you frequently need to reference. For further personalization, there might be specific extensions you're used to using in your development environment, like tools to help with formatting, visualization of certain items like brackets, spell checking, making sure you always close your tags, or even help you complete the line of code that you're writing. And similarly, you might want to personalize the theme for your editing suite. So, for example, to have a high contrast environment. And to speed up your work so that you're ready to go as soon as the environment launches, you might want to have pre-downloaded dependencies that you frequently use or pre-built branches for you to work from. So there are lots of ways to tune a remote dev environment for your needs and different elements that might be standardized across a company or team, or even just for your own environments. Now that we know a bit more about remote work, and we also know a bit more about remote dev environments. So here's my thesis, and I'll try to convince you of it today. Setting up a remote dev environment can actually help improve your remote work experience. Obviously, no tool can make up for a lack of process or a lack of team structure or other organizational issues. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that if you're in the right mindset to adopt remote development and you do it right, it reaps benefits in other ways too. I feel like how we're talking about remote development now is kind of how we're talking about DevOps and having conversations about DevOps a few years ago. DevOps isn't a tool. It's not like you can adopt some new test framework or deployment tool and your developer's work experience will magically improve. Even as much as Google Ads will tell you that that's what they're going to do. But if you tackle the problem the right way and look at it as more than just tooling, but also these organizational changes, then it is worth the change. Specifically, I think that I think that remote development will help improve three areas of remote work. The first, developer onboarding. This includes pair programming, mentoring, and learning. It's much easier to get new employees up and running quickly if their development environment is one less thing to install. Second, developer velocity. This is both about giving developers feedback on their code more quickly and also removing the burden of constantly maintaining a development environment that's up to date with the latest internal requirements. And three, lastly, secure access to shared tools, such as test environments or other production tools. Access to resources becomes a priority when developers need it. Sorry, it's true. Sometimes it's not a priority when it's not, for other roles. And so this makes organizations rethink how they should be accessing these applications, which in turn makes it better for everyone. Let's talk about developer onboarding first. Remote development environments have several technical benefits which come in handy when onboarding. First off, because these environments are spun up from a standard common base like a dev container, they're reproducible, they're known environments. If your team is constantly needing to add something to this environment, then you should add it to the base that gets used by everyone so that you're all working with the same set of tools and in the same environment. There's no more, works on my machine. For onboarding, what this means is that a new developer doesn't need to follow a checklist or more likely, ask around and figure out what tools the team uses and how to get a local test environment set up. They can just get it working. In terms of personalization, as we mentioned earlier, remote environments let you bring your own dot files, themes, and extensions. For onboarding, this means that if your new developer already has some of their personal preferences scripted, It's easy for them to bring it to this new environment. Even if they don't have it scripted, well, then they can set it up once and then use it again and again. And that's not just useful in onboarding. If you upgrade to get a new laptop, or worse, if you lose your existing one, you can still get back to work your way as soon as you get access to another keyboard. Your team might also have some common or custom extensions that everybody uses. And so you can make sure you're using these from day one with personalization. And so it's not just technical benefits for remote dev here, or at least not only technical benefits. Um, Engineering onboarding kind of sucks today for the most part. Making engineering onboarding work sounds like it's just a nice to have, but it's actually really important and really hard to get right. If you think about what onboarding looks like today in a lot of smaller organizations, it's a total mishmash of checklists. That kind of makes sense for some HR tasks like getting your tax withholding information or your bank account information for ACH, but for business tools, that's less great. What I'm seeing now in a few organizations is getting the general onboarding right, frequently as the company starts to grow, but not necessarily getting the engineering onboarding right away. General onboarding is those HR checklists that we mentioned, getting you access to your Google Workspace, access to Slack, provisioning other tools. But engineering onboarding is getting your SSH keys into the right servers and sharing knowledge on what to expect in code reviews. It's just harder to automate and smooth out. This is in part because the team that you have working on onboarding might not be the right set of folks to tackle engineering onboarding as well. So there's kind of like a noticeable drop off after the non-engineering tasks are completed. And anything you can do to improve engineering onboarding is a huge benefit to your engineering team as you continue to grow. There are also other human benefits to using remote dev environments as part of onboarding or for new developers. The main benefit here is pair programming, or helping mentor a new developer as they learn your organization's environment and way of working. Working remotely, it's hard to just step into a room and work on something together. You can step into or call into a Zoom, but it's not the same. It's not the same because you don't have a whiteboard, sure, but you also don't necessarily have the same environment, the same laptop that you're sitting in front of and working from. But what if you did? So you can still pair program remotely by sharing your environment directly. You can do it on a video call and you're most of the way there. And even better, you could have two keyboards instead of having one. So remote dev environments also help with pair programming. We briefly mentioned the situation of it works on my machine. Being able to quickly evaluate and respond to a bug or a code change is critical for developers. The main thing you hear from DevOps teams, or you hear DevOps teams care about today is developer velocity. So what is developer velocity? Well, the DORA State of DevOps report, which is the canonical reference in the industry, categorizes what good looks like for DevOps teams. Elite performing DevOps teams need less than a day to go from code committed to code deployed. And that's because they deploy their services on demand multiple times a day, and because they can restore failure to services in less than an hour. The best performers get their code from ideation into production 106 times faster than the worst performers. When I'm talking about developer velocity, it's not about getting developers to code faster and faster. Folks get confused when they hear that term, developer velocity. Again, it's not about coding faster and getting more work done. It's about making changes quickly and iteratively. If you can make changes quickly, you will get more done. But that's the outcome. That's not the explicit goal that you should be focusing on. By allowing your team to ship bug fixes quickly, for example, they can easily test that a fix works and move on to something else. Or they can get feedback from users that a feature isn't working as expected and iterate. Developer velocity is also just developer happiness. I don't know about you all, but I certainly feel a sense of accomplishment when I can finish a task in one day. It's more satisfying to see your work make an impact than to sit around waiting for a deploy. But reality check, most organizations need some kind of security or compliance controls that prevent you from pushing directly from your workstation to production. Now, I'm a big fan of security, and I feel like I need to point out security doesn't want to slow you down either. They're also just trying to do their job. Their job just might be getting SOC 2 compliance instead of fixing that bug at the top of today's queue. And so you likely have change control requirements for your organization. This means another developer needs to review your code on a regular basis or every time you make a change. And if you don't, you should probably look into that. In the office, this was typically somebody sitting next to you or a few rows over. But even as companies became bigger and more distributed, this became harder, needing a review in a particular language or from someone on a particular team. And that person needs to get context on the issue and on the fix before being able to provide you with feedback. So, to improve developer velocity and happiness, we need to improve how quickly developers can have their code reviewed. Today, the median hours to merge a pull request on GitHub is 5 hours in a work environment. And that doesn't take into account whether or not somebody's actually reviewing the code. That's pretty good. Usually means that you're working with someone in the same time zone, or at least, in a way that lets you review something in your workday. And they're able to provide feedback during your workday. And so you can make a change. What could make this even better? What could make this even faster in some sense? And how can developing remotely help solve this? Well, one of the pain points with code review is seeing the code live. With a remote development environment, you can share an environment with a fix so that somebody else can validate the fix without first having to make it work on my machine. Even better, it means that you can share an environment that's in progress. And while you're waiting for feedback, spin up a new environment and work on another issue. Lets you parallelize what you're trying to get done. So you can get feedback on something that you're already working on without losing your setup for something else that you're trying to solve at the same time. Lastly, let's talk about how remote development indirectly benefits those working remotely by forcing infrastructure teams to improve the experience of remote access overall. Working remote tends to be a poor experience when you're the only one. Others might forget to invite you to meetings, and you might miss the hallway conversations that happen in person. But that's not all. Even things like accessing on-prem or shared resources is hard. If you're the only one that's working remotely, it doesn't necessarily make sense to spend time to optimize how you access the package registry, right? Maybe it's running under Alex's desk and we're all in the office. It's not slow for us and it works. It's too bad that it's slow for you. But when many more folks are working remote and developing remote, then this access to resources becomes a priority. Suddenly, slow or difficult access becomes a problem for everyone. This can start with something as simple as making it easy to access the desktop that you already have sitting at your office if you have one. And try accessing it remotely a few days a week and then maybe try moving it to the cloud so you can develop it from anywhere. But there's a progression to some of these resources available remotely. So what matters when you're both working remotely and developing remotely is secure access to internal resources. When you're developing remotely, you need access to lots of internal shared development resources. Things like package registries or artifact registries, production or test databases, monitoring tools, build pipelines, test environments, everything that a DevOps team might need. When you're working remotely, if you're a developer, you need to access many of the same things. One of the most annoying parts about connecting to a production database, say, is connecting to it the first time. Once somebody else has already done it, they can hopefully script it or at least explain it to you. And that means that when you're, then onboarding a new developer or somebody is newly starting to work remote, they should be able to leverage the knowledge and work of others in the team to access internal development resources that they might need. And even if you're not a developer, there's still many benefits that you get from secure, centralized access to internal resources. Employees need to access internal services quickly and easily, but also securely. Many issues with current remote access solutions they have many issues, including, security, privacy, latency, availability, management overhead, but most importantly for end users, ease of use and latency. And actually, latency is actually one of the concerns I hear the most. If you're accessing an internal resource that's in a different office from you, possibly in a data center halfway across the world, there's going to be latency. This could be worse if you use a VPN concentrator to funnel all traffic to a given location, which could be slow. Ideally, you can connect directly to the resource that you're trying to access. And ideally, there's also a local instance of that service running so that you're not connecting to something unnecessarily far away. Second, if you're making these connections possible yourself, that's potentially a lot of management overhead. You need someone to manage those tunnels. And you've created something that's critical to your infrastructure, where the availability of those connections, the ability to connect remotely to those resources really matters since everybody needs them to do their jobs. So now you have a business critical service you have to maintain. There are security challenges, though, also in accessing internal resources remotely. And this ends up being a blocker for many organizations, or at least what's slowing them down. From a security perspective, having a public endpoint on the web, like you might have with a VPN concentrator to access your internal network, could be a problem. You might also be concerned about having unencrypted traffic going from your users to your internal applications. So you'll want to make sure you have appropriate controls in place. Um, but conversely, there's also a motivation to centralize resources actually for security benefits. With centralized resources, resources become easier to protect. Centralized resources give you one point of entry to your services. So, for example, having a centralized source code gives you one source of truth. Losing an individual machine doesn't mean that you lose the latest code that you've been developing. And it also doesn't mean that you've leaked, all of your source code. So people can develop with some code locally, but you still have a central repository of all that code. That's, still one step away from a fully remote dev environment, but getting there. Centralized resources also let you log and monitor all access in one place, given that you've created a bottleneck for access. So you can access on-prem resources without having to transfer them. This means you can track who's accessing them and change access controls rather than worry about, duplicates of information and where that might have ended up and that type of thing. You can also, in some way, reduce the surface of attack of your environment. If you restrict certain kinds of services, for example, those accessing user data, to only run in a common environment, that's a lot less for your security team to worry about. It's easier to maintain and patch the handful of servers running business critical and privacy sensitive applications than to have to ensure that every developer keeps their device up to date. And then you could, have trust the device to connect to a network, verify its trust. That becomes a problem of access, not one of patch management. Although, of course, you should be also patching those devices. So, in summary, what we discussed today, working remotely and developing remotely are two different things, but they can work really well together. And there's a few ways that developing remotely can actually improve the remote work experience when applied appropriately. Onboarding new developers, such as through pair programming and mentoring, getting them up to speed very quickly by letting them pull from an environment that already exists. Improved developer velocity with faster code reviews by sharing test environments directly or by replicating a bug or a fix in a live environment. Less time to get context means a faster review, and that means happier developers and more productive developers. Accessing shared resources that might not have been a priority to do before. Getting developer resources remotely accessible means that it's easier to get all critical resources remotely accessible and puts everybody on the same footing. And with that, thank you so much for having me, DevXConf. I hope you learned something about remote dev and remote work.